Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming once again. We're always happy to be here at Mentor Public Library. We've been doing these talks for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. I know at least one person's already asked me in the hallway today, are we going to keep going next year? The answer is yes. So if you're interested in these programs, we'll, as I should say, as long as the library is agreeable, we'll keep doing it. And I think it does bear mentioning, too, that this week is National Library Week, and yesterday was National Library Workers' Day. So how about a hand for everybody at Mentor Public Library? And April 20th is the beginning of National Park Week, in case you want to, thank any wonderful National Park Service employees. So, again, thank you for coming, and this is a great turnout. First of all, this is what we're calling an encore presentation, meaning we actually gave this talk several years ago, but as we've been doing these programs now for 6 or 7 years, we realized at one point that, boy, we've put so many good talks together, it's a shame to just do them and then kind of just let them gather dust. So we started kind of bringing back some of the ones we did in the earlier days of this series. So this is one we actually did about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. And so I'm grateful that you're all here. Maybe some of you didn't see it 5 years ago when we did it. Even if you did, you're back to hear it again, which I appreciate. But the bad news is nothing has changed here. This is a great turnout for a really sad story that you all already know the ending to, right? I mean, it's kind of like, 20 years ago when we all got in line to go see Titanic. We all knew what was happening at the end. And by the time it was over, we were probably glad that it was sinking because the movie was so long. But the story here, unfortunately, doesn't change. It's still a tragic event in American history, one that obviously has great significance to us down the street at James A. Garfield National Historic Site for many reasons, not the least of which is, of course, Garfield was the second assassinated president after Abraham Lincoln. But because we are dealing with, leaders and legacies of the Civil War era as the theme of this series of programs, we'll try to keep it more geared towards the Civil War era. And of course, the assassination of Lincoln happens, 5 days after Robert E. Lee surrenders to U.S. Grant, which I hate to tell you is not the end of the Civil War. A lot of people think of it as the end of the war, and certainly the end was very much in sight at that point. Richmond had just fallen to the Union. Lee surrenders. Lincoln's assassinated, but really there are Confederate armies surrendering to Union forces well into May. At any rate, so a lot of people view the Lincoln assassination as really kind of the last really major event of the Civil War, and that's a pretty legitimate way to look at it, if you ask me. Even though the war technically wasn't over, this is the event that really kind of, was the climax of the war. But also, it was the end in some ways, but it was very much the beginning in other ways. And especially, I don't know did anybody watch the Reconstruction documentary on PBS last night? They made an excellent point in there about the fact that, really, Reconstruction is kind of the beginning of this whole new era, and then of course Reconstruction goes off the rails, and really the true legacy of the Civil War is very much in question at that point. But a lot of people view this event, the assassination of Lincoln, as the final tragic event of the war. So this is, like all of these talks, we only have 45 minutes or so because I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So if you have questions at the end, I will happily take questions. So if you have any as we're going through, just hold on to those. But ultimately, this is going to be a fairly quick and rather cursory look at a major event in American history. So hopefully at the end of this, you'll have maybe a little better idea of who some of the people are and the names and places and things like that. But this is by no means an exhaustive examination of the Lincoln assassination. So like any event, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are origins, of course, that come about, in this case, over a year before Lincoln is actually assassinated. You all know, of course, that in March of 1864, Lincoln brings U.S. Grant from the west to the east, makes Grant a lieutenant general, has to resurrect that rank and get congressional approval to do so, makes Grant a lieutenant or 3-star general, and basically puts Grant in charge of all Union military forces, really trying to bring the war to a close. One of the first things that Grant does once he's been given that rank and has been placed in command of the overall Union war effort is he stops exchanging prisoners. There had been a system of prisoner exchanges. 20 Union soldiers are captured, 20 Confederate soldiers are captured, so we'll just swap them, basically. And Grant has been fighting long enough in the West to realize that this is a pretty self-destructive system for the Union because, of course, those Confederate soldiers will get back to the lines and immediately get put back into the ranks. So they're basically fighting soldiers that they've already captured and parole or exchanged. So Grant decides to put an end to the system of prisoner of war exchanges shortly after becoming the commanding general of Union forces. This greatly angers many people in the South. Of course, the South at this point is very, very short on men and material. And so this is something that is taken with, is viewed with great anger in the South. And it was around this time, we think, that a guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth began to come up with some kind of a plan to alter the way that the war was going for the South. Booth's original plan was to kidnap Lincoln and hold him for ransom and basically demand that prisoner exchanges continue. Obviously, that plan never really came to fruition, so that was Booth's kind of first idea of what he might do to try to impact the war for the South. Booth was from Maryland, and he was a Southern sympathizer. He's famous for another reason, even besides shooting Lincoln later, and most of you probably know that, but we'll talk about that as we go through. Oh, or we'll talk about it right now. So, who was John Wilkes Booth? He was somewhat famous for the day. He was an actor. He came from a very famous theatrical family. His father was an actor. His brother was an actor. And in fact, his brother and his father were both far more famous than he was, as an actor at least. And they were both, more highly regarded as actors as well. But he had kind of gone into the family business like his father and his brother. And become an actor. And of course, we know that Lincoln and several other major Union leaders had seen Booth on the stage many times. I mean, believe it or not, Lincoln had actually seen Booth perform at Ford's Theater at one point. So Booth was not somebody who's, he's not a Lee Harvey Oswald who's just a nobody that really hardly anyone has ever heard of before. He is somewhat well known in certainly around Washington, where he performs at Ford's Theater fairly regularly, but even in other parts of the country, Booth is not somebody who's just a nobody. And at one point when Lincoln had seen Booth perform in November of 1863, about 10 days before the Gettysburg Address, Booth looked up and saw Lincoln applauding at the end of the show and told somebody, "I would rather have the applause of a Negro to that of the president." So that is obviously not meant as a compliment coming from the mouth of John Wilkes Booth. Now, this is a very famous photo. Some of you probably know the significance of this photo. This, of course, is Lincoln giving his second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865. So Lincoln, of course, has been reelected for a second term. There was some doubt about whether or not Lincoln would be reelected. Lincoln himself at one point was sure he would not be reelected. But of course, a number of things happened that made people in the northern states realize that the war was starting to go well for the Union and was coming, maybe the end was in sight. So Lincoln is reelected in the fall of 1864 and gives his second inaugural address here on March 4th of 1865. So here is Abraham Lincoln right here, obviously very tall. He's very easy to make out once you know what to look for. I believe this is Frederick Douglass down here. And again, if you watched the PBS documentary last night, there's a kind of a close-up of that section of the photo when they were talking about Douglass meeting Andrew Johnson. And I don't know if Johnson's in there, but I believe that is Douglass. But there's also somebody else very famous in this photo. And that, of course, is right up here on the balcony is John Wilkes Booth, watching and listening to Lincoln's inauguration. So again, Lincoln is here talking to thousands of people, and probably the people in these couple of rows and maybe up here were actually able to hear what he was saying. It's not, the modern era where we have microphones and all that. So even a guy like James Garfield, who has the sort of a loud, booming, kind of deep voice, and probably was very good at, projecting his voice, was often giving speeches to people who, many of them, couldn't hear a word he was saying. So how many of these folks could actually hear what Lincoln was saying? We don't know. Certainly most of them read the address in the newspaper the next day. But yes, John Wilkes Booth is in fact right up here in the crowd watching Lincoln deliver that second inaugural address. and even says to somebody or writes to somebody, what an excellent chance I had to kill the president if I wished to do so on Inauguration Day. And from that distance, maybe he could have. So I mentioned Lee Harvey Oswald a minute ago. You know, for 55 years now, there's been all this talk about, was there a conspiracy to kill Kennedy? And some people think there was, and some people think there wasn't, and there's never really been anything proven definitively that I'm aware of. We know there was a conspiracy to kill Lincoln. There was a conspiracy to kidnap Lincoln originally, and then at some point, and we'll talk about that here in a second, that conspiracy changed from kidnapping Lincoln to actually killing him. So here are a look at some of the co-conspirators that Booth kind of drafted into helping him with this plan. Samuel Arnold, George Azarat, David Harold, Michael O'Loughlin, Lewis Powell, and John Surratt. And the Surratt name, of course, is well known because he was the son of Mary Surratt, who was also considered a conspirator. She was his mother. She owned a tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland. That's aptly named, I would say. This is, you know, back in the old days when if nobody was there and you opened up a bit, you could just call the town, name it after yourself. Nothing wrong with that. She continued to own that tavern even after she moved into Washington, D.C. in 1864. Her husband died while serving in the Confederate Army. I don't know if he was killed or if he died of, you know, disease, but he died in the Confederate Army. And they had owned this home in Washington. When he died, of course, the home, you know, became hers, and so she moved into the house, but continued to maintain ownership of the tavern back in Maryland as well. And, you know, you've probably heard this said before, but Washington, D.C. really is kind of a southern city at this point. You know, it was sort of carved out of part of Maryland and part of Virginia, but it really has more of a southern sort of sensibility about it. Even at this point, you know, late in the Civil War, it's still thought of as kind of a southern city. So she moves into Washington, into this townhouse, opens up basically a boarding house, and she begins to take in boarders, as was not at all uncommon. Even members of Congress went to Washington and boarded in boarding houses because they didn't necessarily have permanent homes that they owned there in the city, because they were only there for, you know, a few months at a time, and then they would go back to, you know, Ohio or Pennsylvania or New Jersey or wherever they were from. So she opened the house to boarders to make a little bit of extra money, and John Wilkes Booth was one of the boarders who stayed there fairly regularly when he was in Washington. So Mary Surratt is a very, very interesting case study here because we're still not 100% sure just how deep her involvement in this conspiracy was. And as you'll see later, a number of the conspirators that were eventually convicted did insist that she really had nothing to do with this. But that's not the way the government saw it. So her even to this day, her involvement is somewhat questioned. Probably 10 or so years ago, I think it was Robert Redford actually made a film about her, and I'm blanking on the name of the film. Maybe The Conspirator? Is it something like that? I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, I believe it's Robin Wright, who's famous for like House of Cards and things like that on Netflix. I think she's the one that plays Mary Surratt in this film. So, you know, a big time sort of Hollywood treatment of what happened to Mary Surratt, and, you know, kind of trying to figure out or dramatize the level of involvement that she may or may not have had in this conspiracy. But at any rate, she, for our purposes, is considered a co-conspirator here in the plot. This is this White House right here, and I capitalized White House in there, which I probably should not have done. That might have been an autocorrect. It's not the White House; it's a White House. This one right here. That's the boarding house that she owned, the townhouse that she owned in Washington that she turned into a boarding house. That's where John Wilkes Booth frequently stayed when he was in Washington, and that is where the government argued that a lot of the plotting and planning for this conspiracy to first kidnap and then eventually kill Abraham Lincoln took place. This photo is not from the era. This photo is from about 25 years after the assassination, but it was the earliest one that I was able to get my hands on. But as far as I can tell, the house really, here in 1890 or so, looks pretty similar to what it looked like in 1865 when Mary Surratt owned it and when supposedly all of this plotting was going on inside on this plan to kidnap and then kill Lincoln. So in April of 1865, so on April 3rd, the capital of Richmond, the Confederate capital of Richmond, falls to Union forces. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet evacuate the city, not until they've burned a number of important Confederate government documents. They evacuate the city, and in fact, a lot of retreating Confederates set the city on fire. They would rather see the city destroyed than allow Union troops to find anything of value there that they can use to continue to fight the war. It's also interesting to note that among the Union troops that were pouring into Richmond were African American troops, U.S. colored troops. And so you can imagine how, you know, the bulk of white Southerners in Richmond felt about the idea of black troops coming into their city. So in fact, it was Union troops, including black troops, that were trying to put the fires out around Richmond. The next day, just 24 hours after the city falls to Union forces, Lincoln makes kind of an unscheduled visit and walks through the city. And of course, in this is a dramatized image, of course. We don't have any photos of him in Richmond, but you can see there are African Americans kind of crowding around him, intended to be seen as, you know, people who are now being freed from slavery because the Union is about to win the war. And of course, knowing that the Emancipation Proclamation is in effect, these African Americans are aware that they are now free, or soon will be. Lincoln makes this sort of triumphant, almost like a conqueror, even though he didn't view it that way, trip into Richmond, walks through the streets, and even visits the Confederate White House, the home that Jefferson Davis had lived in until really just a day or two before evacuating with the Confederate government. So Lincoln makes this visit to Richmond on April 4th, and then of course on April 9th, the anniversary, of course, of this was yesterday. Robert E. Lee, here in gray, surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to U.S. Grant, here in blue. Again, that is not technically the end of the war, although that is an indication that the war is going to be over very soon. Again, there are still 3 major Confederate armies in the field at this point. The largest surrender doesn't actually take place until May, but this is the one that everybody kind of concentrated on because, whether right or wrong, the Eastern Theater, where Richmond was located and Washington, D.C. were located, this is the theater that most people had been paying attention to. Now, the theater in which the Union had the most success, and where guys like U.S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and even James Garfield fought and won victories for the Union really early on in the war, was actually in the West. So I would argue that the Western Theater is probably in the grand scheme of things, far more important than the Eastern Theater, but the Eastern Theater is where we have battles like, Antietam and both Manassas battles and Gettysburg and Fredericksburg and, Spotsylvania and all these really famous battles. And of course, it's also, again, where those capitals were located. I mean, Washington and Richmond are, what, 100 miles apart, if that? So that's the theater that people really tend to, even today, to concentrate on when they're thinking about the Civil War. So even though Lee's surrender did not mean the war was over, it meant that the end was definitely in sight. The most important battle, the most important, army rather, the most important Confederate commander had now capitulated, and it was clear that the Union was going to win. It was really just a matter of time at this point. On the evening of April 11th, so the anniversary of that will be tomorrow, Lincoln actually appears kind of at the door or maybe on the balcony of the White House and gives kind of an impromptu speech. And in that speech, he endorsed, and they mentioned this in the documentary last night for those of you who watched it, he endorsed the idea of suffrage for what he called the most intelligent African Americans, and of course for black men who had served the Union cause in the Army or the Navy. So Lincoln is now starting to broach the subject of, we've now freed the enslaved. Now what are we going to do with them? What rights are we going to afford them as Americans? And so here the war is not even technically over yet, and he's already starting to talk about who among the black population will be able to vote. And of course, for somebody like John Wilkes Booth, who is, a diehard supporter of the Confederacy, an avowed white supremacist, this is not at all what he wants to hear. And you can see, that means, pardon the language, but this is verbatim, that means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll run him through. That's the last speech he'll ever give. This is Booth talking about Lincoln. So it's at this point, if not before, but certainly by this point, that Booth decides kidnapping Lincoln is no longer the priority. Killing Lincoln is now the priority. So if he had not already come to that decision, and maybe he had, certainly by the time of this speech on the evening of April 11th, Booth is now coming around to, okay, now the mission is not to kidnap Lincoln, because what's the point? The war's almost over. Kidnapping Lincoln and demanding that exchanges of Confederate prisoners start back up is pointless. Killing Lincoln, avenging the South becomes the priority. So on April 14th, 1865, this is another image of John Wilkes Booth here. Booth writes to his mother, tells her, our cause is lost. We must do something great and decisive. Obviously, we know what he was thinking would be a great and decisive act. And then reads in the paper that day that Lincoln and his wife will actually go to Ford's Theater that night and see Our American Cousin, which is a very popular comedy. And so Booth decides, okay, this is my chance. And of course, keep in mind, Booth's an actor. He's performed at Ford's Theater multiple times. He can come and go as he pleases at a place like Ford's Theater. His presence is not going to raise any eyebrows at a place like Ford's Theater, because that's the world he lives in. Also that day, Booth met with the co-conspirators for the last time. The idea here was not just to kill Lincoln. The idea here was to basically decapitate the entire federal government. So Lewis Powell is told that his job is to murder H Seward, who's the Secretary of State. George Atzerodt is to kill Andrew Johnson, who's the vice president. And there were a number of other people sent out to attack other government officials as well. So this is really not necessarily a strike specifically at Lincoln. This is a strike really against the entire federal government. So Booth's mission here is not simply to kill Lincoln. It's to really incapacitate the entire Union federal government. So Atzerodt is suddenly very nervous about this whole thing. He tells Booth he didn't sign on to kill anyone. He signed on for a kidnapping. And of course, Booth, if somebody starts to pull out now, then the whole plan is going to fall apart. So he tells Atzerodt, of course, it's too late now. You're in too far. Booth talks to Mary Surratt and arranges to have a package sent to her tavern down in Maryland. Again, remember, they're all in Washington, D.C. at this point, but Mary Surratt still owns the tavern down in Maryland in Surrattsville. So he's arranging to have guns and ammunition and other tools and things sent to the tavern, because, of course, his idea is that he's going to escape after he kills Lincoln, and he's going to head in that direction and try to pick up those weapons and other things that he might need. It's this conversation between Booth and Mary Surratt that really gives the government the evidence that it feels it needs to charge her as a co-conspirator later on. It's this whole idea that, if he's telling her he's going to arrange to have this package sent to her tavern, doesn't logic tell you that he probably told her what was in it and why he was doing it and why he was going to need these things at some point that night? Don't know if he did or not, but as far as the government was concerned, this was enough evidence to charge Mary Surratt as a full co-conspirator in this conspiracy to kill Lincoln. And then finally, Booth gives instructions that everybody's supposed to strike as simultaneously as they can. It's, again, they don't have cell phones or anything to text each other about, what time to, at exactly 10:02 we're gonna strike. But they're supposed to all strike as simultaneously as they can in kind of a coordinated series of attacks shortly after 10 p.m. So again, on Lincoln, on Seward, on Johnson, all at the same time. This is Ford's Theater as it appeared in 1865. The Lincolns were committed to going to the theater that night, even though they actually talked about not going because they were both so exhausted. But Lincoln was in a fairly good mood because obviously the war was coming to an end, and this great struggle was about to conclude. So they finally decided, yes, they were going to keep the appointment at the theater, and they were going to go. And then they started trying to find someone else to go with them because, of course, they had a box, and they had plenty of room in the box. So they actually invited the Grants, Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia. They decided to decline because they wanted to travel down to New Jersey that night because their children were in New Jersey. They wanted to go see their kids. So they actually kind of fished around for a number of couples that would accompany them that night, and finally got to Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, whose name was Clara Harris. Clara Harris was the daughter of a U.S. Senator from New York, and interestingly enough, was Henry Rathbone's stepbrother. So they were step-siblings and then eventually decided to get married. So that's maybe another program someday. But at any rate, Rathbone, who had fought in the war, had served in the Army of the Potomac, had been in action at places like Manassas and other battles, they agreed to accompany the President and Mrs. Lincoln to Ford's Theater. As, of course, is common among very important people, Lincoln had a bunch of meetings that day, and they ran a little late. So he and Mary Lincoln and the Rathbones didn't actually get to Ford's Theater until after the play had already started. So, of course, it's the President of the United States, so everybody, the performance stops and everybody applauds, and they come into the theater and they take their seat in the theater. It was packed that night. This was a very popular play with a very popular actress. Laura Keene was the name of the actress. And then, of course, it was also packed because a lot of people knew the President of the United States was going to be there. You could learn that by reading the newspaper, as John Wilkes Booth did. So here's the box in which the Lincolns were seated. There's, of course, a door in the back there. Maybe some of you have been to Ford's Theater, and so you've seen this setup. Ford's Theater is still there, still an active theater. I mean, they still do plays there. I believe it burned down at one point and was reconstructed. But at any rate, Ford's Theater is still there. There was supposed to be somebody posted at the door. Not really sure what happened to that guy. There's some stories that he got drunk and kind of, went somewhere and passed out. There's some stories he just kind of wandered away, and then there's some stories that they never actually posted anyone there. But for whatever reason, that back door into that box was not guarded. So there was nobody there to really stop Booth from entering the box. And again, as I mentioned earlier, John Wilkes Booth is an actor. Everybody at Ford's Theater knows who he is. They see him there all the time. They don't question his presence. They don't, stop him and say, you can't go up there or whatever. He can kind of come and go as he pleases at a place like Ford's Theater. So there was really no challenge at all to Booth gaining access to the presidential box. So this is, again, this is one of those events in history. There's no photos, obviously, but here's an image of an artist's rendition of Booth actually shooting Lincoln. He enters the box. It's, the play is a comedy, so everybody's laughing, so he can do this undetected. He kind of opens the door and sneaks in the back, barricades the door so nobody can get in, and basically kind of stood there and waited until there was a moment where he knew there would be a big laugh, because it's a comedy, he's an actor, he knows the play, he knows the dialogue, and so when there's a big laugh, that's when he actually steps forward and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, using the laughter to try to muffle the sound a little bit of the pistol. Of course, Rathbone is sitting right there, so he hears the shot. He tries to stop Booth after Booth has already shot Lincoln. Booth produces a knife, which you can see in his hand right there. So he's got the Derringer in his right hand and the knife in his left. And he basically sort of makes a slashing motion and ends up slicing Rathbone's arm almost down to the bone. So very, very serious injury. So Rathbone is just bleeding profusely from this huge gash in his arm from the knife. And then famously, you're probably all familiar with this, Booth actually, he had barricaded the door when he came in, so he clearly had an idea of how he was getting out of there, which was he was going to leap out of the box onto the stage, and that's exactly what he did. So he leaps out of the box. Of course, Lincoln has fallen to the floor. He's been shot in the back of the head. Rathbone is on the floor bleeding profusely from this massive cut on his arm. Supposedly, Booth yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is the state motto of Virginia, which is also "thus always to tyrants." Not sure if that really happened or not. Supposedly it did, so I'll say supposedly, but as far as we know, that's what he said. And he jumps out of the box onto the stage. And of course, we all know when he hits the stage, he breaks his leg. So now he's got to escape from Ford's Theater and escape really out of the city of Washington, because he's just shot the President of the United States with a broken leg. Lincoln, of course, is lying on the ground. He's very seriously injured, of course. He's taken a bullet to the back of his head. Rathbone is still laying on the ground, holding his arm, trying to stop the bleeding, and he's yelling at everybody to stop that man. And of course, you have to remember, this all happens very quickly. It's taking me 5 minutes to describe it, but it all happens in the blink of an eye. And people are shocked. They don't know what's going on. They hear this sound, they hear Rathbone scream. Suddenly there's this guy on the stage. What's going on here? So Booth is able to escape. So this all happens very, very quickly. There are a number of doctors in the crowd. Several of them are taken up to the box to examine Lincoln. And of course, one of them immediately says, it's a mortal wound. He's not going to live. The bullet had penetrated behind his left ear and then kind of traveled through his head and sort of lodged here sort of above his right eye. So it basically kind of passed right through his brain and lodged above his right eye. And of course, even in 1865, it doesn't take a doctor very long to say that's a mortal wound. It probably would be today as well. But Lincoln is still alive. He didn't die immediately, so he is actually, rather than being put in a carriage and taken back to the White House, which is what they did to James Garfield after he got shot eventually, they carry Lincoln across the street to a boarding house, and it's called the Peterson House, still there also. You can visit that too. And Ford's Theater and the Peterson House are both run by the National Park Service. So, they carry Lincoln across the street because they know that this bumpy ride across the sort of the cobblestone streets of Washington is going to make his condition much worse than it already is. So they decide not to carry him back to the White House. They take him across the street to the Peterson House. So, again, the attack on Lincoln was not the only attack that took place that night. Lewis Powell had been tasked with attacking William H. Seward, who was the Secretary of State. So Seward was already injured. Seward had been in a carriage accident not too long before the assassination and was basically laid up in bed trying to heal after this carriage accident. So everybody knows this, of course. Again, it's in the newspapers. So Powell actually shows up at Seward's door and pretends to be from a pharmacy. He's delivering medicine to the Secretary of State because he's been injured in this carriage accident a few days or a week before. So again, Powell also didn't really have much of an issue getting into Seward's house, just as Booth didn't have much problem getting into Lincoln's box at Ford's Theater. So once Powell gets into the house, he produces a knife. He attacks Seward, who's lying in bed. Seward's son, Frederick, who was an undersecretary of state, basically working for his father, came in and tried to stop Powell. Frederick Seward was also slashed and injured pretty seriously, and then Powell escapes out of the house. Seward, now who's already injured from this carriage accident, now has also been attacked with a knife. This is an image of Seward after the attack, and you can see on sort of the droop on the right side of his face there and the scar and everything. After this attack on Seward, he didn't really have too many photos taken showing the right side of his face because of how damaged it was after this attack. You can also see here Seward aged very, very quickly, not only because of the stresses of his office, but because of all of the tragedy that surrounded this entire incident. So anyway, this is William Henry Seward. He looks very different. If you've seen other pictures of him, he looks very, very different with this sort of scar on his face and also this droop there on the right side of his face. Now, as Seward is healing, his family purposely doesn't tell him what's happened to Lincoln because they want him to heal. They don't want him to become despondent because he and Lincoln were very, very close. Seward had actually been the guy that everybody expected to be nominated for president by the Republicans in 1860. Lincoln ended up winning the nomination. Seward agreed to become Secretary of State, originally thinking, oh, well, that's the most important job in the cabinet. That will allow me to really kind of be the puppet master behind this, this country bumpkin who the people have, accidentally elected president. Well, Seward gets to Washington, starts working for Lincoln, and realizes very soon that, what we all know now, that Lincoln was brilliant and knew exactly what he was doing. So Seward actually changed his tune and became very, very dedicated to Lincoln, and they became very good friends. In fact, the reason that Andrew Johnson was on Lincoln's re-election ticket in 1864 was a number of people were trying to get Seward out of the cabinet, and by promoting to get rid of Seward and make somebody else Secretary of State, and Lincoln said no, he needed Seward too much, and so he took this compromise with these folks who wanted a different vice presidential candidate, who wanted a Southern Democrat, and agreed to have Andrew Johnson on the ticket. So really it was people trying to force Seward out of the cabinet that allowed Andrew Johnson to come in and become the vice presidential candidate. And hey, you know, what difference does it make? A vice president, he's never going to become president anyway, right? Nobody saw this coming, obviously. So at any rate, so Seward's family, as he's trying to heal from this attack, they don't tell him what's happened. When they do finally tell him that Lincoln, in fact, had been murdered, Seward says, as you can see on the screen there, I knew this, as had he lived, he would have been the first to call on me. So kind of another sort of heartbreaking side to this tale as well. So again, Azarat was the one who had kind of resisted Booth on April 14th when Booth said, we're now going to kill all these people rather than kidnap them. Azarat was the one that said, I didn't sign on for a murder, I signed on for a kidnapping. So Azarat actually did not make his attack on Andrew Johnson. He kind of, you know, he chickened out basically. He sat there in a bar basically for a good part of the night and tried to decide what to do, and then eventually just kind of wandered the streets of the city for most of the night, but he did not make the attack on Andrew Johnson that he was supposed to make. So Johnson was not injured that night as he was supposed to have been. Again, Lincoln did not die right away. He shot around 10:30 or so in the evening. They carry him to the Peterson house. He never regains consciousness. His family assembled there, his wife, his oldest son, Robert. Contrary to popular belief, Robert Lincoln was not present at 3 presidential assassinations. He was not there when Lincoln was shot, when his father was shot. He was actually in the White House, and when he found out what had happened, he went to the Peterson house. He was there when Abraham Lincoln died, but he wasn't present when Lincoln was shot. Almost 40 years later, he was not standing beside William McKinley when McKinley was shot. There's a story that he was in Buffalo at the Pan American Exposition when McKinley was shot. That is not true. He was on a train on his way to Buffalo when McKinley was shot. So when Robert Lincoln got off the train, he was told the president had been shot, and he was then taken to see McKinley, who was still alive, and everybody at that point thought he would heal. In fact, the only presidential assassination at which Robert Lincoln was actually present was that of James Garfield. So Robert Lincoln was James Garfield's Secretary of War and was in the train station and about 40 feet away walking towards Garfield on July 2nd, 1881, when Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau. So of the 3 presidential assassinations that Robert Lincoln lived through, Garfield's, in fact, was the only one at which he was present when the attack was made. At any rate, Mary Lincoln, Robert Lincoln, they gather at the Peterson house. Most of the cabinet shows up, and they are all there at about 7:22 on the morning of April 15th when Lincoln is finally pronounced dead. And this is when Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, makes that very famous statement, now he belongs to the ages, which is certainly true. So, of course, John Wilkes Booth is on the run. Even with his broken leg, he's now on the run. He makes his way into Maryland, which is still technically part of the Union, even though it was a border state. So it's not a Confederate state, but there are certainly plenty of Southern sympathizers in Maryland. One of them is this guy, Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd is the guy that set Booth's broken leg. They make it to Surratt's Tavern, they get the weapons and the things that they had arranged to have shipped there, and then they go visit Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd is a Confederate sympathizer, he's a slave owner, he's a farmer, and he's of course a medical doctor, and Mudd is the guy that sets Booth's broken leg. Mudd is also, kind of like Mary Surratt, it's a gray area here on how involved was he? Did he know who Booth was when Booth showed up asking him to set his leg? Was he aware, even if he knew who Booth was, what Booth had just done, shooting Lincoln? I don't know. There is plenty of research out there. There are plenty of books that have been written and plenty of descendants of Samuel Mudd still living saying he had nothing to do with any of it. He's an innocent bystander here. He's a doctor. He's taken the Hippocratic Oath. somebody shows up hurt, he's got to help him. I don't know. I have no idea. So I'm not even going to speculate on whether or not he was involved or not. But at any rate, he set Booth's leg, and then he gave him a pair of crutches, and then Booth left. So Booth sees Mudd, gets his leg set, and then moves on down the road. This is a great map here showing Booth's escape route. Here's Ford's Theater, where he shot Lincoln. Then he makes his way to Surratt Tavern, where he gets the weapons. Here is Mudd's house, and that's where he gets his legs set. And then he makes, he continues on down through Maryland here to the home of a guy named Samuel Cox, who I don't believe was ever charged with anything and was not accused of being involved in this in any way, as Dr. Mudd was. So he stops briefly at Cox's house, and then really for the next almost week or so he's camping basically in the woods here in southern Maryland, trying to make his way into Virginia. Because, of course, if he gets to Virginia, that is a Confederate state, and so he feels like maybe if he makes it to Virginia, he'll be safe. I don't know why he would have thought that, because, of course, the war was almost over, and Virginia, for the most part, was conquered by the Union. But at any rate, he's trying to get to Virginia. You see this home here of Colonel Hughes. This is actually he was trying to get over to Virginia, and he got kind of sidetracked and ended up back in Maryland. So he stopped here sort of accidentally. And when he realized he was still in Maryland, got back in the boat and tried to make his way down to Virginia, which he finally did. And then we have Lucas's farm, and then Garrett's farm here, where he was finally caught. So he did make it a pretty good ways, considering he had a broken leg, and he was the most wanted man in the country at this point. So this is an old wanted poster offering a $100,000 reward for the capture of Booth. There's John Surratt, John Wilkes Booth, and then David Harold on this wanted poster as well. And then the map here showing Booth's escape route. So Booth managed to avoid capture for about 12 days after the assassination. The federal troops did finally catch up to him down here at Garrett's farm. Booth had arrived there on April 24th. And was kind of hiding out in the barn, and then federal troops were on his trail and eventually arrived there sometime early on April 26th, and they basically told Booth to come out of the barn, and Booth refused to do so. David Harold was with Booth, and Harold came out of the barn with his hands up. Booth refused to come out, and basically saying he'd rather be killed than come out. They set the barn on fire. They were trying to kind of smoke him out, and as he was moving around inside the barn trying to figure out where to go, one of the soldiers basically took a shot at him through the slats of the barn and hit him in the neck. And so Booth was shot and was actually partially paralyzed by the wound. So his spine was partially severed, and they pulled him out of the barn and pulled him up onto the porch of Garrett's house, and Booth tells the soldiers, these are Union soldiers, of course, to tell my mother I died for my country. And of course, in his mind, his country is the Confederacy, not the United States. And then the last words that we're aware of that he said was he asked them to lift up his arms so he could see his hands, because again, he was paralyzed, he couldn't move. And he looked at his hands and called them useless, which is true, because of course, even had he lived, he probably would have been a quadriplegic perhaps for the rest of his life. And then he died about 2 hours later, and he was only 27. So he's a young man when he died. So he was, but he died. He lived about 2 hours after being shot. As far as the other conspirators, most of them were all captured in federal custody by the end of April. There were a number of people arrested who really ultimately were released without charges because they ultimately had nothing to do with this. From the guy who was holding a horse at one point to basically anybody that Booth or any of the co-conspirators had even interacted with that night were at one point or another arrested and questioned, and then most of them were ultimately released. So Arnold, Azerodt, Harold, Mudd, O'Loughlin, Powell, Spangler, who we've not mentioned before, he was a stagehand at Ford's Theater, And excuse me, and Mary Surratt were all ordered to be tried, not by a civilian court, but by a military tribunal. And again, Mary Surratt is the one that people still kind of question how much involvement did she really have. She and Mudd are the two that we're still not 100% sure how involved they really were, if at all. One of the members of the tribunal was a guy named Lew Wallace, who was a Union general, and then later was the author of Ben-Hur, the very famous novel Ben-Hur, which became later the very famous Charlton Heston movie. And then later in 1881, when James Garfield was president, he made Lew Wallace the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, which of course is now Turkey. But he actually gave Lew Wallace a job as what we would think of today as like an ambassador. And I didn't put it in here, but it's also worth mentioning that the guy that was in charge of this whole tribunal and eventually was in charge of carrying out the executions of those found guilty was Winfield Scott Hancock, very famous Civil War general. You know, I mean, probably the greatest corps commander the Union had throughout the entire Civil War. And in 1880, the Democratic candidate for President of the United States, who lost to who? James Garfield. There you go. I knew Debbie would know. I was wondering if anybody else would know. But yeah, so in fact, I didn't put that in here, but in fact, Hancock was the guy that was in charge of kind of the tribunal and eventually carrying out the executions. So several of the conspirators were found guilty, and several of them were sentenced to die. Mary Surratt, Powell, Harold, and Azarat were all found guilty and executed on July 7th, 1865. So less than 3 months after the assassination, these folks have been tried, they've been convicted, they've been found guilty, and they've been now on July 7th executed. And so this happened at the old Washington. It's in Washington where this took place. And again, Hancock was the guy that was kind of in charge of this whole process. So again, Mary Surratt is very controversial because she was the first woman that the U.S. government had ever put to death. And again, a lot of the other conspirators said she had nothing to do with this. She was not involved. She's an innocent bystander. She just happened to own the boarding house where we did a lot of the planning, but she was not involved. Now, there's some question about were they saying that simply because she was a woman and it was the honorable thing to do to try to save her life? Don't know. There's also some speculation that one of the reasons that she was found guilty was because she was Catholic. And you know, there was certainly an element of anti-Catholic sentiment in certain sectors of the population at that point. So we're not 100% sure how involved she really was, but she was in fact found guilty, and she was in fact executed. So here's some close-ups of some of the executions about to take place. So here are two of the conspirators about to be hanged. You can see the noose around the neck. Same here. This is, I believe, Azarat right here, or Powell. There's so many of them I can't keep them all straight. But anyway, you can see their legs are, this guy's legs are bound together. But this is the one over here that's really kind of heartbreaking. This is Mary Surratt seated. So she's, you know, emotional, understandably, and she's receiving counsel from a priest. You can see the, you know, the vestiges over the priest's neck there. And if you got really, really close to this photo, you can kind of see her face a little bit. And, you know, they're covering her up from the sun with an umbrella. But yeah, this is Mary Surratt, I mean, just moments before she's executed. And then ultimately, this is the conspirators that were all hanged there together on July 7th of 1865. And of course, you can see Mary Surratt here. You know that's her simply because she's got the dress on. So other conspirators were found guilty but were not sentenced to death. Dr. Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin were found to have had lesser degrees of involvement, and therefore they were sentenced to life in prison. Spangler was the stagehand from Ford's Theater, who they felt like maybe was somewhat peripherally involved because, again, he held a horse at some point. So that's not sure that would hold up today, but at any rate, that is what happened to Spangler. He was convicted for a 6-year term. O'Loughlin went to prison and died there just 2 years later. Mudd, Arnold, and Spangler all went to prison for what they thought would be life sentences. And then in February of 1869, not quite 4 years after the assassination, they were pardoned by Andrew Johnson, who was on his way out of the presidency as Ulysses S. Grant was about to come in and become president. Mudd is particularly interesting. Again, he's a medical doctor, and he was sent down to Fort Jefferson, which is a very remote prison in the Florida Keys. And there at one point was a yellow fever outbreak, and he was providing, you know, medical assistance to the inmates there that were suffering from yellow fever. And so when somebody pressed his case for a pardon to the president, that was one of the things they argued, was that, you know, he had shown great you know, medical skill and also empathy with these inmates that were suffering during this yellow fever outbreak. Now, one co-conspirator did, in fact, escape punishment, and that's John Surratt, the son of Mary Surratt. Again, Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. government. Her son, John Surratt, escaped. He got out of the country before they found him, made his way to Quebec, and then on to, and of course, the Surratts were Catholic, so he was hidden in Quebec by priests, and then eventually made his way over to Europe, went to England in September, and then went to the Papal States, the Vatican, and became a papal guard. So he's actually like one of the, he was in the sort of, I guess you would consider it a military force or a security force that guards the Pope. And so he was found, the U.S. tracked him down, and they eventually tracked him down in Egypt and brought him back to the United States in November of 1866, about a year and a half after the assassination. He did go to trial for being a co-conspirator in the assassination, and the jury just couldn't come to a verdict. So John Surratt is the only one of these co-conspirators who never, other than, you know, when he was being held during his trial, he lived as a free man for the rest of his life, and he lived until 1916. So he's the only one of the co-conspirators that escaped any kind of real punishment for his role in the assassination. Lincoln, of course, you know, died on April 15th. They held services for him in Washington. His body lay and stayed in the White House for a while, and then his body was put on a train and carried on a very circuitous route back to Springfield, Illinois, where he was from. And actually, they disinterred his son, he and Mary Lincoln's son, Willie, who had died in the White House in February of 1862, and he had been buried in Washington. They disinterred him, and Lincoln's body and that of Willie, the son, were sent back to Springfield to be put at rest together. So this is the route that Lincoln's funeral train took from Washington all the way back to Springfield. This was basically a recreation of the route he took when he was coming to Washington in 1861 for his inauguration. And you can see it did, in fact, pass right through Cleveland. And there is at least one photo that I'm aware of that actually shows sort of a contingent of people basically waiting for the train, the Lincoln funeral train, to pull into Cleveland in April of 1865. This is the Lincoln tomb today. Lincoln's body was disturbed many, many times after it was interred in Springfield. This is Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. And in fact, eventually they just decided to put the bodies down into basically a crypt. I believe it's about 10 feet deep, and then just completely covered in concrete, because Lincoln's, you know, there were a number of sort of ghoulish people out there that thought that they would take Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom. It was a way to make money. And so Lincoln's body was actually disturbed many times, and was even stolen at one point. There was a book, oh gosh, probably 10 or 15 years ago, called Stealing Lincoln's Body, which detailed some of these all very ghoulish, and some, frankly, a little bit humorous too, kind of how sort of bumbling some of these guys were, these attempts to steal Lincoln's body. But eventually, in the very early 20th century, they put all of the bodies about 10 feet down and just covered them in concrete, so nobody can can disturb them. So this tomb today holds the remains of Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, and then 3 of their 4 sons. The only one not in this tomb is Robert Lincoln, the only son they had that survived to adulthood. He's the one that eventually became Garfield's Secretary of War and was there when Garfield was shot. Robert Lincoln is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Northern Virginia. And then, of course, just to wrap it up, Lincoln, of course, everybody knows about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's revered by most as the greatest president in American history, or certainly the second greatest. Is the lowest he ever shows up on any of those rankings. Sometimes he's below George Washington, but usually above Washington. And again, I'll refer back to the documentary that aired last night on PBS, Part 1 at least, that talking about the Civil War was, in many ways the end of some things, but in many ways the beginning of others. And of course, that Reconstruction period and just how contentious it was and how much promise it started off with and then really what it became. Had Lincoln lived, almost certainly the Reconstruction period, I'm sure, would have still been difficult, but would have been far less difficult than it turned out to be. Because Lincoln wanted this lenient Reconstruction policy that allowed the southern states to come back relatively easily, as long as they were willing to accept, emancipation and these amendments to the Constitution that granting citizenship and voting rights and things like that to African Americans. But really, Lincoln wanted it to be an easy Reconstruction because creating hard feelings would only make things worse for decades to come. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So Lincoln saw that that was a possibility. Had Lincoln lived, I think it's safe to say it certainly would have been a very different story, maybe a much easier story, and who knows how different American history might have been. John Wilkes Booth, who wanted to be a hero to the South, wanted to avenge the South, in fact, is the one that really made things far more difficult for the South than they probably would have been otherwise. So, Booth killed the one guy who really wanted to treat the South fairly, and instead ended up putting Reconstruction into the hands of radical Republicans who wanted a very harsh and punitive Reconstruction on the South. So things could have been quite different had Lincoln lived. And then, of course, just one last look here. This, of course, is the statue of Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And that's Lincoln's legacy, saving the Union, emancipating the slaves, putting us, making the government live up to its promises as enumerated in both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Making sure that, in fact, all men really are created equal. There is no lower class based on race or anything like that. So that really is Lincoln's legacy. Does anybody have questions about anything I've covered today? I'm certainly no expert on this subject, but I will try to answer whatever I can.
Yes, I was just thinking, if the plan was to take off the head of the U.S. government, paralyze them, if Andrew Johnson would have been killed by Azeroth, was there a secession line like there is today with the House? Would they have fallen on Johnson?
That's a great question. There was a line of succession. It is not the same as it is today. Today, of course, it's the president and then the vice president, and then I believe does it go to the Speaker of the House? That was not the case at the time. It may at that point have gone to the Secretary of State, who of course was Seward, which is one of the reasons Seward was attacked as well. Seward was also a very, very vocal, some would say radical abolitionist, so he also was offensive to guys like Booth and the co-conspirators for that reason as well. But I think the reason that they included Seward in that plan was because they basically would have killed, Lincoln, Johnson, and Seward, the 3 guys who were in that line of succession. Now, again, that line of succession that we have today was not in place at that point. So there was one. Whether or not it was it must have been formally encoded somewhere, but I'm not sure if that was. It was probably in some kind of federal law or statute, but it was not nearly as formally encoded as it is today. But I believe that's why Seward was included in the plan. Go ahead.
Did Lincoln's body go through an embalming process?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. Lincoln was embalmed. Embalming actually really became an acceptable and widely used tactic to preserve bodies during the Civil War. Embalmers, basically kind of followed armies around and made deals. I mean, soldiers sometimes had, you know, before they went into battle, were making contracts with embalmers so that if they were killed, assuming their body could be identified, which was not always the case, because of course soldiers in the Civil War weren't wearing dog tags or anything like we have today, that their body would, you know, the embalmer was contracted to embalm the body so that the body could be returned to the family and properly buried. So, so embalming became a very standard practice in the United States during the Civil War. And there are, in fact, a few interesting photos actually showing embalmers set up in a, you know, in front of a tent, embalming bodies of soldiers that had been killed. Far more common for Union soldiers than Confederate. But anyway, yes, to answer your question, Lincoln was embalmed. There's some, you know, evidence that the embalming was not, you know, hugely effective. That, you know, because of course Lincoln's body then went on this tour. You know, I showed the image of the funeral train. You know, this is a, whereas today if this happens, you know, you can put the body on a plane and have it in Springfield in 2 hours. You know, it took 2.5 weeks for Lincoln's body, after it was embalmed and lay in state in the White House, to make it from Washington back on this very circuitous route all the way back to Springfield. And everywhere they went, they took the casket off of the train and they put it on public display so people could look at Lincoln's face one more time. And there are recollections from people that said, you know, you could see it was, the decomposition process was very much delayed because of the embalming, but you could still start to see where there were spots that were starting to show up. So, but yes, his body was embalmed. There's a, I don't know if you might be able to find it on YouTube, but there, gosh, probably in the, I'm going to say the late 1950s or very early 1960s, there was an interview done on TV with a man who at that point was quite elderly, but as a child grew up in Springfield, Illinois, and in the very early 20th century when they were disinterring the Lincolns for the last time and we're going to drop them into this very large, deep vault and then cover them with concrete, his father was one of the guys contracted to actually dig them out, you know, take them out and prepare this new vault. And of course, when they took the caskets out, they opened the caskets to visual confirmation. Yes, they're in there, and we can drop them into this vault, and they're there. We know they'll be there into perpetuity. This boy was pulled out of school and went to the cemetery and was there when they opened the casket. So the guy was interviewed in the late 50s or early 60s as the last person to see the face of Abraham Lincoln. And he recalled that, you know, yes, the body was not in great shape, but it was still clearly Lincoln. And so yeah, you look for that. You might be able to find that on YouTube. I'm not sure. I should have looked for that. But so yeah, Lincoln was embalmed, but you know, embalming in 1865 was not quite as advanced as it is, you know, in today. Yes?
Do we know if Booth had relatives in the war, you know, that were shot or killed?
You know,
what was his mental state that he's so worked up against the Union? That's
a great question. And first of all, I don't know if he had any relatives fighting in the war. All of his immediate family were not involved in the war. And in fact, I know his brother and I think his father, but his brother definitely were actually very strong Unionists. So he was kind of the odd man out in that family in terms of being a Confederate sympathizer. They're all, you know, from Maryland, which is, again, a border state. There was lots of Union sentiment in Maryland. There was lots of Confederate sentiment in Maryland, too. So Maryland and Missouri and Delaware and Kentucky are these border states. So I don't know of any Booths that were fighting, whether it was for the Confederacy or for the Union, but certainly his brother and I think his father, too, were very much pro-Union. And in fact, do you guys know the story about Robert Lincoln being saved on the train station? Have you heard that story before? Robert Lincoln, during the war, I believe this was in New Jersey somewhere, was waiting for a train, and he took a sort of an odd step, and he fell onto the train tracks. And of course, the train, you can hear the train coming, and this guy kind of yanks him back up on the tracks, and turns out it's Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's brother. And that is not, you know, hyperbole. I mean, that happened. Robert Lincoln remembered that, and he wrote about that, and he said he recognized Edwin Booth when he looked at him, because of course Edwin Booth is a famous actor just like John Wilkes Booth. So, you know, here's, ironically enough, the brother of the guy that kills Abraham Lincoln saves Abraham Lincoln's son at one point. You know, I think this was in 1863 or so, but Robert Lincoln himself told that story, that that did in fact happen. So, you know, there's an interesting tie there too, but I don't know of any Booths that were actually fighting for the Confederacy or for the Union. That doesn't mean there weren't any, but certainly John Wilkes Booth was quite an odd man out in that family, because he was so pro-Confederacy and so pro-white supremacy, and his dad and his brother were not. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but it's certainly an interesting thing to consider.
Was pardoning those guys by Grant, was that a political move since he was leaving office?
Well, that was done by Andrew Johnson.
Oh, whoever.
Yeah, as Grant was coming in. I mean, I think it was partially political. I mean, you know, Andrew Johnson was a Southern Democrat. He was anti-secession. You know, he was a senator from Tennessee when the war started. He was the only Southern senator that stayed in the Senate, loyal to the Union, when all of these other Southern senators were leaving to go join the Confederacy. But Andrew Johnson was also an avowed white supremacist. So Andrew Johnson was of the opinion that, you know, secession was a plot that was created by the wealthy planter class in the South. And Andrew Johnson hated the wealthy planter class because he was a poor, white, working class, you know, man from Tennessee. So even though he was anti-secession, he was still very much pro-white supremacy as well, and certainly did not have any problem at all with the lynchings and murders of black people going on in the South, and certainly did not have any particular animus one way or the other against some of guys like Mudd and some of these more, shall we say, peripheral co-conspirators. Again, had John Wilkes Booth lived, I don't see Andrew Johnson pardoning John Wilkes Booth, but somebody like Mudd, especially when Mudd had demonstrated, you know, his compassion for his fellow inmates during the yellow fever outbreak at Fort Jefferson, all that kind of stuff, and some of these other guys who were, you know, their involvement was certainly less, you know, less deep than somebody like Booth. I think, you know, it was partially political, and it was partially maybe just sort of a, you know, merciful on at least as he viewed it on his part. So, sure.
Does the Surratt boarding house still exist, or did it already?
I don't know if the boarding house is still there. I think there is still something at the site of the tavern in Maryland. I am not sure about the boarding house, actually. Again, that photo that I showed was from 1890, so about 25 years after the assassination, but whether or not that building is still there, I'm not 100% sure. But I think there's something there at the site of the where the tavern was down in Maryland, but whether it's the original building or something reconstructed or even just an interpretive sign or something, I don't really know, but I think I did read that there's something there in Maryland. I don't know about the house, but I could certainly find that out probably, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. Sure, I'll go in the back here and then I'll come up.
Any comments on Mary Todd Lincoln?
Regarding, well,
Right after the assassination, did she go back to the White House and stay there for a while?
The question was what happened to Mary Lincoln. Of course, Mary Lincoln had a very difficult life after the assassination. You know, we all know that, you know, she was viewed as mentally unstable for a while. Her own son had her committed at one point. You know, certainly she went back to the White House long enough to pack up the things that were hers and send them back to Springfield. And I think she traveled on the train. But no, she didn't. Okay. She locked herself up in the White House. Okay, there we go. How long she stayed, I don't know. So
More than a month.
Okay, sort of like, Lyndon Johnson told Mrs. Kennedy, she could stay as long as she needed to after the Kennedy assassination. I guess Andrew Johnson kind of had to do something similar here with Mary Lincoln. So I didn't know that part of the story. But yeah, I mean, clearly she had a very difficult life. And 3 of her 4 sons died very young. Her husband is, murdered right beside her. So I think she can be forgiven for maybe having some difficulties later in life. She lived into the 1880s, and then when she died, she was buried in Springfield next to her husband. But yeah, she certainly had a very difficult life. And then her relationship with Robert, who was the only son that survived, was also somewhat contentious later on, because he did at one point, in fact, have her committed because he was worried she was, going off the deep end and was maybe a danger to herself. So she didn't take very kindly to being committed by her own son either. So yeah, she had a very difficult life, after his assassination. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
This calls for a lot of speculation on your part.
Sure.
I apologize, but
That's the fun part. I can't be wrong.
he died, of course, so early in his second term. But do you think there was a possibility that he and Johnson butted heads as president and vice president? He would have considered running for a 3rd term?
Ooh, I don't know. I doubt it. I mean, at that point, most presidents, sort of viewed it as the right thing to do to serve only 2 terms, because, of course, that was the example George Washington had set. Washington could have been president for life if he'd wanted to, and then just kind of voluntarily walked away from it after 2 terms. All presidents up to that point who had been elected to 2 terms had followed that example. I dare say that with the reverence he had for Washington, I think Lincoln would have followed that. The other thing we know about Lincoln is that he had talked to before he left Springfield to go for his first term to go as president, he talked to his law partner and told the law partner that when this was all over, he would come back and they'd go on practicing law like nothing had ever happened. And he and Mary had also talked about traveling after he was not president anymore, about going to see the Holy Land. Lincoln wanted to go out and see California. So I think that, of course, it's impossible to say. I mean, who knows at what stage Reconstruction might have been had Lincoln lived by 1868, when he would have been due to either finish or run for a 3rd term. So I dare say that I think he probably would not have run for a 3rd term, but who knows? I mean, did Franklin Roosevelt set out to serve 4 terms? I don't know. By the time that 3rd term came along, World War II's going on, and it seems very dangerous maybe to get somebody in who's new to the job. So, and then of course by 44, same thing. The war's still going on, and maybe it seemed you don't want to change horses in midstream, as they say. So, I think Lincoln would have probably served out that 2nd term and been done, but who knows what the circumstances might have been to compel him to try to run again. I don't know. I don't think so, but anything's possible. Well, it's not possible now. It was possible then. Anybody else? I know we've kind of gone over here. I apologize, but nobody threw anything, so I guess we're okay. So next month, it'll be the 2nd Wednesday of May. Next month will be a talk about the 14th Amendment. That's a new program, a new presentation about the 14th Amendment next month. So May, whatever the 2nd Wednesday in May is, be here or be there or be square, as they say. So thank you very much.